Hi, my name's Will John from ADAS and I'm here today with Hugh Keenan, and we're going to put together a few short videos looking at soils, their health and management. These videos are going to accompany our webinar on soil management, which we hope you find useful and informative. I'll include a few links within the document, and I'll also put an email address at the end, so if you have any questions or queries relating to any aspects of soil management, feel free to get in touch and we'll do our best to answer them. Thank you.
Hi, welcome to the webinar. There's a lot to talk about, so without further ado, I'll just talk you through the contents, what we're hoping to achieve this evening. I'll start off by talking about why soils are important. I'll then go on to talk a bit about soil health, and then break it down into soil sampling and testing, soil drainage, structure and biology, and finish up towards the end just talking about soils and the impact of organic manures, and bring it all together with a summary at the end. Why are soils important? Well, a healthy soil is fundamental to farming systems and to producing the food we eat. It provides the means for plants to grow, which also helps create the oxygen we breathe and indeed cleans the water we drink. Soil can also increase our resilience to climate change by storing carbon, locking in the greenhouse gases that would otherwise be released into the atmosphere, and even help prevent flooding. So soils are an incredibly important resource, and it's important that we manage them to the best of our abilities. Moving on to soil health then, I would imagine it'll be difficult to take in everything in this diagram, but it's here for a reason, and that's to sort of demonstrate that soils are complex. There's a lot going on. The soils you have on your farm, the soil type will be dictated by the geology, the climate, nutrient inputs, or indeed lack of nutrient inputs, salinity. There are so many things going on in terms of compaction, aeration, nitrogen fixation, organic matter levels. It's probably beyond the remit of most of us to look at all these individual aspects of soil health. So what we need to do is find a more simplistic approach to looking at the soils on our farms. And so, in summary, I think we have to take everything on that previous diagram and condense it down. And an assessment of soil health, really, we need an integrated approach which links the chemistry, the physics, and the biology. And ADAS, along with its partners, have developed a scorecard approach and evaluated this box below, which I think is a more simplistic methodology for looking at soils. So we have the indicators. The top box is pH and routine nutrients. This is the starting point for most farms. We'd look at soil phosphorus, potassium and magnesiums, and as a benchmark, we've got the Nutrient Management Guide RB209. In terms of soil structure, we have the visual soil assessment for soil structure, or VES as it's known, and this has been developed by SIUC. I'll be talking about this in a bit more detail later on. Moving on to soil organic matter, this is normally tested for in the labs by loss on ignition. Again, I'll be talking about this in a little bit more detail, but it is important when you're thinking about soil organic matter is comparing it with typical levels for your farm with your soils and your climate. And then last but by no means least, we have earthworms. These are the engineers of your soil. I'll give you a few links in a minute to some excellent fact sheets, an AHDB fact sheet on earthworms and how to identify them, and do a count to work out the health of your soil based on earthworm activity. Okay, so we've got a number of useful references here, but it's important to note that as this is a pre-recorded webinar, you won't be able to click on these links, but if you can pause the webinar and take down the details, these are all free downloads. The visual assessment of soil structure, we have how to count earthworms from the AHDB library, and I've copied one side of the fact sheet onto the right-hand side of this slide. Very simple, easy way of identifying the type of worms, the type of where they are within the soil profile, and how to count them. Great fun. And then finally, Think Soils Manual, which again can be found on the AHDB Knowledge Library, an excellent book. Well, moving on to soil chemistry and soil testing, I think it's worth noting that soil testing, it can save you money. If you've got a lot of organic manures and you've been putting on a lot of fertilizers, you may well find that if soil indices have got quite high, you have the opportunities to save money by reducing your fertilizer inputs. And we can certainly demonstrate examples of where we've been able to help farmers with this. At the other end of the spectrum, where perhaps inputs have been a bit low over the years, you have the opportunity to increase productivity. And last but by no means least, soil testing does have the opportunity to help improve the environment. This would very much be linked with soil phosphorus indices, and where soil testing comes back with elevated indices 4, 5 and above, we'd certainly recommend that inputs of phosphates were omitted from these fields, because certainly as the indices increase, it's been demonstrated that phosphate does become increasingly mobile, and when it gets into watercourses, there are implications for the environment. So moving on to the standard soil analysis, this is the starting point for most farmers and growers. You'd get the pH or the lime requirement, and for most grassland farms or farms with the occasional corn crop, 6 to 6.5 is really where you need to be. If you're on a peaty soil, inevitably the pH wouldn't get up this high, and if you're in a continuous arable system, you may wish to aim higher for index for the pH of 7. The target index for soil phosphorus is 2. It's 2- for potassium, and it's 2 for magnesium. It's quite rare to find low soil magnesium indices, but where they do occur, we'd recommend, if lime levels are low, the use of magnesium limestone. And when we're testing a field, we'll take a number of representative subsamples. If it's permanent pasture, we'd test to about 7.5 centimeters. If it's rotational ground, arable ground, we'd normally go down to 15 centimeters for each of our cores. The standard analysis is relatively cheap. It's less than £10 a sample, and it's, you know, an excellent starting point when we look at the soils on our farms. We do get asked quite a lot for more detailed soil analyses, and there are a number of other things you can test for. I will talk a bit more about soil textural analysis and soil organic matter, but there are opportunities for detailed field mapping, as this diagram on the right demonstrates, opportunities for looking at cation exchange capacity, active carbon, trace elements, even soil mineral nitrogen. And the relevance of these tests is really going to depend on your farm system. If you're an extensive farm, predominantly grassland with a clay loam type of soil, soil organic matter levels are probably going to be quite good. If you're growing high-end crops, then you may well wish to look at soil mineral nitrogen, this spring being a case in point where we had an extremely wet winter and soil mineral nitrogen levels were low, and that would have had implications for the nitrogen use that spring. And whilst it's important to do an analysis which provides a good line in the sand, it is important that it's not taken as a one-off. We do need to monitor over time and pick up trends. So going back to soil texture then, this diagram on the right, it shows that all our soils are really, will have components of clay, sand and silty loams, and they'll have a bit of each in them. A sandy soil is obviously easier to work, it has a wide window for growing, but it will have reduced water and nutrient holding capacity. At the other end of the spectrum, a clay soil will have better water and nutrient holding capacity, but it will be slowly draining and have a smaller window for cultivation. Silty soils are a balance of properties between the sandy and clay soils. They are prone to capping, however. It is important to know your soil texture. I'll give an example of an organic farmer. If they can demonstrate that the clay content in the soil is less than 20%, they may be eligible for a derogation to import sources of potash. So very important to know if you're an organic farmer on sandy soils. Moving on to soil organic matter, well, there's no easily defined critical level of organic matter below which soil functions become impaired. What we really have to focus on here is your cropping and your soil type, and a typical or target soil organic matter level will depend very much on what the crop is and where you live to a certain extent. So in the diagram we have here, we have clay content from the left, 0 to 10%, increasing to 40 to 50% over on the right. And you'll notice that the soil organic carbon percentage on the left increases as clay content increases. And the content will also increase with a grassland soil over an arable soil. So to put it at its most simple, if you're permanent grassland on a clay soil or a medium loam, it's highly likely you're not going to have problems with soil organic matter levels, and you're probably going to have 6 to 8% soil organic matter. If you're on a sandy soil, you're an arable farmer who doesn't incorporate straw or bring in organic manures, in a dry climate, then it's entirely likely that your soil organic matter levels could be down at 1 or 2%. So it'll very much differ depending on where you are and your type of farming. And again, what's important is identifying organic matter levels and then trying to build if indeed your levels are a bit on the low side. Moving on to drainage then. Good soil drainage, it's fundamental for healthy crops, healthy livestock, clean river water, and longer periods for efficient field activities. I was talking to a colleague of mine who's a drainage expert, and he was saying that the majority of drainage systems, they've been in about 30 years now, and when they were designed to cope with only about 16 mil of rain in a day. Certainly over the last couple of years, we've had a lot of high rainfall events, and drains such as this one on the left will struggle to cope with these intense events. And we cannot stress highly enough, do not neglect such an expensive and valuable asset. This slide, I put this slide in to show that land drains, not only do they aid the removal of excess soil water through slowly permeable soils, so water from rain, but they're also very important for controlling rising groundwater levels. And I think a lot of people miss that. And just one block drain can do this, and in fact, a lot worse. These are typical problems we come across all the time. The picture on the left, well, the field may well have land drains in it, but they're not going to be functioning very well because you've got a silted up ditch and the outfalls will be blocked. And the picture on the right, again, very common occurrence of a blocked up drain. And even though these are typical problems, there are often very simple solutions. The picture on the left is a little bit blurred, but I think it does illustrate a very well managed drainage feature with a rotational policy of cleaning out the drains and keeping them running. And the picture on the right here, well, it's the same picture from the previous slide here on the right. Has just been cleaned out and it's starting to run again. So very simple solutions to problems which can, well, have big problems in agriculture.
Okay, so here we have a field of stubble turnips. Prior to drilling the crop, it was very wet field and very limited workability windows. So what we've done is we've re-cleaned out this drainage outfall ditch, and in doing so we've come across a lot of these old clay pipe sections that were very blocked with silt and sediment, or the actual clay pipe had broken. So simply it was a matter of minutes of removing the old pipes, and yeah, as I say, in a few minutes the water was washing through, cleaning the pipe, and the water was flowing back down the ditches again. And in terms of the field, we've managed to increase the workability window, grow the crop and utilise it sort of all year round now, rather than as before it was very wet. So at the field here now was winter barley, now into oilseed rape, direct drilled with a weave-in drill. As you can see, the 95% of the field is established well, and the crop is away and looking good. And we're here now to try and investigate this corner of the field that's poor establishment, and the crop is looking stressed. So we're going to go and dig a soil pit to have a look.
So we've dug our soil pit. This is the profile we've taken out. The top 6 inches or so is quite compact. It's got a high bulk density, very, very stiff indeed. Interestingly, the subsoil is relatively friable, there's more vertical fissuring, and actually it's reasonably dry. If I try and do the worm test on this piece of soil, actually it's quite dry. Now it'll be close to the plastic limit, but it's actually surprisingly dry given the condition in the rest of the field. Now over here we have an example of 2 plants that we've dug up. This first one from this wet compacted area here, and literally 20 meters away we have these plants which clearly chalk and cheese. Look at these roots developing down here. Just the vigor of these plants is completely different in the space of about 20 meters. So we know this area is wet, we've got a bit of compaction on the top, but if you look at the soil pit we've dug, it's filled up with water. Highly likely we've got a broken land drain here. The main gateway to this field is going to be heavily trafficked, and in all likelihood there's a block drain. Now this gives us an opportunity to look at more modern technologies like drones, and the latest drones are able to give us fantastic geophysical data. Spring, when the soil's drying out, it's a good time to get a drone into the sky. It should be able to pick up land drains, and it should be able for you to identify where you've got impeded drainage or broken drainage, and then you can dig a hole and rectify as appropriate.
So maintaining good drainage is all about cleaning ditches for the sake of you and that of your neighbours. Fencing ditches from livestock is another good idea. As we've discussed, locating and keeping outfalls clear. Many farms don't have drainage maps, but if you know where the drains are, it's a good idea to mark them on a map, not only for yourself but for future generations. Jetting, rodding and replacing block sections goes without saying, and indeed renewing drainage where necessary. I will go and talk a little bit more about mold draining and subsoiling later on, and it all comes back to good soil and field management. It's all interlinked. Another link here is the AHDB Field Drainage Guide. Excellent document, and that's a free download. Moving on to soil structure, this is a great photograph just demonstrating, probably taken from the same field, where the plant on the right obviously established in an area of compacted topsoil, and you can see how the plant has been stunted and the roots have become stunted, and then comparing that with the plant on the left, which has got a fantastic deeper root. I think we could all agree that this is a good, well-structured soil. You don't have to be a soil scientist to know that this looks very healthy, good porosity, friable, small rounded structures, and you can see good root development.
Hi, well, here we are in a field of stubble turnips. This is quite a heavy field, but we've got a fantastic soil profile to work with here. The first thing that jumps out at you is this clay subsoil. We can also pick up the organic matter layer here, which is where the cover crop was ploughed in. Now, in terms of the top 5 or so inches or so, the first piece I've broken off, I don't know if you can see this, but there's lots of rusty mottles, and this will signify seasonal waterlogging. So we know it's a wet field. By poking around here, we can it's breaking up easily enough. If I were to do the worm test to identify if this field is at the plastic limit, I shall roll away. And as we can see, I'm actually rolling this bit of soil into quite a thin worm. This would indicate that the soil is at or above the plastic limit and it shouldn't be worked. Again, you don't need to be a rocket scientist to recognize that. What else can we say about this soil? Well, there are land drains in this field, and with this clay subsoil, it would lend itself to mold draining. The mold drain should run perpendicular to the land drains and should do a good job of helping to dry out these fields and increase workability days.
But can't stress highly enough, dig holes, because first impressions often tell you everything. This clearly is a very wet field. Opportunities are limited, but I will talk about this slide again when we get onto mold drains. I also previously talked about VES, or the visual evaluation of soil structure. This is a quick and simple test that assesses soil structure based on the appearance and the feel of a block of soil dug out with a spade. You can download the fact sheet on how to do it, how to extract a soil block, how to examine the soil block, to break it up, and to assign a score. Now, I think the beauty of VES is you do actually get a score. If the structure is good, you'll be giving it a score of 1 to 2, and a poorer structured soil would be given a score of 4 to 5. Why is this important? Because we're always talking about monitoring over a period of time, and if you assess a score, it can be quite useful to say, okay, it was a 4, now it's a 3 or a 2, or indeed it was a 2 and now it's a 3 and a 4. Why has the structure deteriorated? So assuming we have poor structure and compaction, what do we do to alleviate it? Well, it is important to identify where that compaction is. So digging a soil pit and identifying whether you've got compaction in the top or the bottom of the profile. And it's all about the appropriate cultivation for the soil type and the level of compaction. And one of the best things you can do is carry out the worm test. This involves getting a bit of soil in your hand, rolling it out into a worm. We've got a picture on the right. The worm So the top of the man's hand has been rolled out into a worm. You can see that it is rolled out. It's reached or the soil is at the or above the plastic limit, and therefore too wet to cultivate. The worm just below it, as it's been rolled thin, has started breaking up. You can see the fissures. So it's below the plastic limit, suitable to cultivate. Very simple test to do. Slit aeration then. This is typically used to alleviate compaction in the top 150 mil or so. It's often caused by livestock, and the machines we see here are used to alleviate it. It is important, again, to dig a soil pit, and it's pointless carrying out this cultivation if the ground is too wet. It's also a good idea to avoid cultivations in new lays due to the risk of root damage. And here's a great photograph of the grass field that's been slit in the spring. It's too wet, and as you can see, you've got smearing and you've wasted a bit of diesel and a bit of time. Moving on to subsoiling then, this is generally aimed at deeper levels of compaction. The subsoiler is usually set to about 50 mil below the compacted layer. Tine spacing is important. So if you're on a conventional tine, then the tine spacing should be 1 to 1.5 the tine depth. But if you're on a winged tine, then the spacing should be 2 to 2.5 times the tine depth. I think it's also worth stating that you do need good drainage in the soil below, because if you have a compacted layer and you get the subsoiler in, it alleviates the compaction, the water can percolate, but if you have a clay subsoil with no land drains, there's nowhere for that water to go. So it's important that it's interlinked with good drainage. And again, we've got a couple of good diagrams here. The one on the right, you've got lifting at the appropriate soil moisture level, and you can see the shattering happening. The example on the left, well, the soil is at the plastic limit, and this subsoiler, well, they've used a lot of diesel and wasted a bit of money really by doing that. It's achieved nothing. Talk a little bit about mole ploughing then. The normal depth for mole draining is 50 to 55 centimeters, run perpendicular to a land drain and intercepting the permeable backfill. And that assumes that the top of the land drain is at around 75 centimeters. We were talking about the plastic limit, and I think it's important to notice that if you're mole ploughing, unlike for subsoiling, the soil at the working depth, it needs to be sufficiently plastic to form a stable channel. However, the topsoil above the mole, it should be dry enough to avoid damage, give good traction and encourage fissuring. And if a field doesn't have land drains, you can actually draw a mole straight out from a suitable ditch. And a few slides ago, I had a picture of an extremely heavy clay, very wet field, no land drains. And for that field, the most obvious thing to do would be to run the mole out of the ditch. Those are the main points relating to soil chemistry, structure and biology, but I thought it'd be worth spending just a moment or two talking about soils and manure management and other issues. We've got potential changes to legislation in Wales, and it's important to consider the management of organic manures on your holding. Organic manures are a great source of fertilizer, and it's a great source of organic manures, but they need to be managed appropriately. And risk mapping is important. So all farms should really have a risk map, which are going to identify where you can spread and where you shouldn't spread. So within 10 meters of a water course, within 50 meters of a borehole and so forth, you wouldn't be spreading manures. But if you have reasonably freely draining soil, then it may be perfectly okay to be spreading manures for a good part of the year. I say that obviously depending on legislation, be it NVZ, or you would also have to take into account any glass tier management plans that you might have in place. But based on the current guidelines then, do you have sufficient land on which to spread the manures? Do you need to export manures from your holding? Or at the other end of the spectrum, do you import organic manures onto your holding? What are the implications? Certainly the way legislation seems to be going, knowledge of the amount of manures spread on the land is increasingly important. And allied to that, farms have the opportunity to reduce ammonia emissions. Many contractors these days will have trailing hose, trailing shoes, and these low trajectory slurry spreading methods of spreading slurry will reduce ammonia emissions on the farm and actually increase the nitrogen availability to the crop. And it's also worth saying that farms have plenty of opportunities by management of the soil for reducing carbon emissions, be it the use of cover crops, minimum tillage, and so forth. So huge opportunities for farmers to assist with climate change mitigation. So that was a run through the main aspects of soils, their management and their husbandry. But if I can summarize, soils are complex, but I think we should focus on keeping it simple and the main areas of soil nutrients, biology and structure. The climate, the geology and the soil type, as well as the farming system, is really going to impact on the decision-making processes. And we shouldn't consider soil testing or digging soil pits as a one-off. It's important to monitor these soils over time. Dig soil pits frequently, carry out the worm test, doesn't cost anything, doesn't take much time to do. Appropriate cultivations at the right time of year. Sometimes it may be appropriate to do nothing. You may well have identified compaction, but it's been a wet year, you just haven't had the opportunity to get onto the fields, and it's not the end of the world. You've identified that there may be an issue to be rectified at the appropriate time. And as for the previous slide, farms have plenty of opportunities to help with climate change mitigation. So there you have it. Soil's an incredibly important resource for us all, and plenty of things we can do to monitor, assess and improve. I hope you found that talk informative and useful. My email address is on this slide. Should you have any questions or queries or want to get in touch, feel free to contact me. Thank you.